The red Georgia clay seemed to bleed beneath Reverend Elijah Blackwood's boots as he strode across the sprawling plantation grounds. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight, the air thick with humidity that clung to skin and made breathing laborious. Blackwood's plantation, named Salvation, stretched for acres across Wilkes County, Georgia, land that had been in his family for 3 generations. At 45, the Reverend cut an imposing figure. Tall and broad-shouldered with silver streaking his dark hair, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed God had personally blessed his endeavors. The locals regarded him as a pillar of the community, a man of God whose Sunday sermons drew crowds from neighboring counties. Few knew the true nature of his practices behind the closed doors of Salvation. The plantation house loomed ahead, a grand white structure with imposing columns and wide verandas. From a distance, it resembled the temples Blackwood often described in his sermons, a place of worship. But for those who lived and worked on the plantation, it was a place of dread. "Reverend Blackwood, sir," called a voice from behind him. Isaiah, the plantation overseer, hurried to catch up. A man with weathered skin and cold eyes, Isaiah had served the Blackwood family since childhood and had risen to his position through unwavering loyalty and a willingness to enforce the Reverend's will without question. "What is it, Isaiah?" Blackwood asked without breaking his stride. "The new shipment arrived, sir. 5 women, 3 men, strong stock, just as you requested." Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Have them cleaned and brought to the barn for inspection at sundown. I want to assess them before their assigned duties." "Yes, sir. And there's something else." Isaiah lowered his voice. "Your nieces have arrived from Savannah. Their carriage came while you were in town." This news stopped Blackwood in his tracks. A smile spread across his face, revealing perfectly maintained teeth, unusual for a man of his age in 1842. "Excellent. Have them settled in the East Wing. I'll greet them at dinner." The East Wing of the Blackwood mansion had stood empty for nearly a year, since the death of Blackwood's sister Elizabeth. Now her daughters, Sarah and Rebecca, had come to live with their uncle as stipulated in Elizabeth's will. At 19 and 17, the girls had been raised in Savannah society, sheltered from the harsh realities of plantation life, despite their family's wealth coming from the same source. Inside the mansion, the oppressive heat of the day gave way to relative coolness, maintained by high ceilings and slaves who worked continuously to fan the air. Martha, the head house slave, directed a flurry of activity as she prepared for the arrival of the Reverend's nieces. "Make sure those rooms are immaculate," she instructed a young slave girl named Celia. "The Reverend will inspect them himself, and you know what happens if he's displeased." Celia, no more than 15, nodded nervously. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the bedsheets. The scars on her back from previous corrections had barely healed. "Yes, Miss Martha, I'll make them perfect." Martha's stern expression softened momentarily. She glanced around to ensure they were alone before whispering, "Be careful around the young ladies, especially the Reverend's eldest niece. She has her uncle's temperament, from what I hear." In the kitchen, preparation for the evening meal was underway under the watchful eye of Ezra, the elderly cook who had survived 3 generations of Blackwoods. His hands, gnarled with age and work, moved with surprising grace as he directed the kitchen staff. "Samuel, check the roast. Dinah, those vegetables need more seasoning." His voice was quiet, but carried authority born from decades of experience. "The Reverend likes his meals perfect when he has guests, especially family." Samuel, a muscular man in his 30s, who had once attempted escape only to be caught and severely punished, approached Ezra when the others were occupied. "I heard rumors in town," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "about why the Reverend wants his nieces here." Ezra shot him a warning glance. "Quiet your tongue if you want to keep it. Walls have ears here." The older man had survived by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Just do your work and stay invisible. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the plantation, Sarah and Rebecca Blackwood settled into their new quarters. The sisters shared a striking resemblance, both with chestnut hair, delicate features, and the same deep blue eyes as their uncle. But where Sarah carried herself with confidence bordering on arrogance, Rebecca was quieter, more observant. "It's smaller than I expected," Sarah remarked, inspecting the room with a critical eye. Mother always described Uncle Elijah's home as the grandest in Georgia. Rebecca moved to the window, gazing out at the fields where slaves still worked, despite the late hour. "It's still impressive, Sarah, and now it's our home." A shiver ran through her despite the warmth. "Did you notice how the slaves look at us? With such fear." Sarah waved a dismissive hand. "They look at all white folk that way. Don't concern yourself with it." She opened her trunk and began laying out dresses for dinner. "Uncle Elijah is one of the wealthiest men in the county. We should be grateful he's taken us in." Rebecca remained at the window, watching as a group of new slaves were marched toward a barn in the distance. "I suppose," she said softly, "but something feels wrong here. Can't you sense it?" Before Sarah could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Martha, who had come to help the young women prepare for dinner. The conversation ended abruptly as the sisters allowed themselves to be dressed in their finest clothing, befitting their status as Blackwood heirs. Dinner that evening was an elaborate affair. The dining room gleamed with polished silver and crystal, illuminated by dozens of candles that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. Reverend Blackwood sat at the head of the table, resplendent in a tailored black suit that emphasized his position as both plantation master and man of God. "My dear nieces," he began, raising a glass of wine in toast, "how you've grown into the very image of your blessed mother. Elizabeth would be proud to see you now, taken into God's grace and my protection." Sarah beamed at the compliment, while Rebecca offered a more reserved smile, her eyes taking in the opulence around them, and the slaves standing silently against the walls, ready to serve at a moment's notice. "We are grateful for your hospitality, Uncle," Sarah replied. "Mother always spoke highly of you and your devotion." Blackwood's smile widened. "Devotion is precisely the right word, my dear. Devotion to God, to family, and to the natural order he has established." He took a sip of wine before continuing. "And speaking of God's order, I hope you'll both join me for services on Sunday. The local congregation is eager to meet Elizabeth's daughters." Throughout the meal, Blackwood questioned his nieces about their education, their social connections in Savannah, and their understanding of Scripture. Sarah eagerly engaged, quoting Bible verses with practiced precision. Rebecca contributed less, her attention repeatedly drawn to the silent slaves who moved like shadows around the room. One in particular caught her notice, a young woman with startlingly intelligent eyes, who seemed to be watching the proceedings with barely concealed contempt. When she approached to refill Rebecca's water glass, their eyes met briefly, and Rebecca felt a jolt of connection that disturbed her. As the evening progressed, Blackwood's conversation took a more pointed turn. "You are both of marriageable age now," he observed, "though I must say the prospects in this county are somewhat limited for young ladies of your breeding and education." "Mother hoped we might find suitable matches in Savannah," Sarah said. "She had several families in mind." Blackwood dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "Your mother, God rest her soul, had grand ideas that didn't always align with practical realities. No, I believe God has a more specific purpose for the Blackwood bloodline." The way he emphasized bloodline sent a chill through Rebecca. She glanced at Sarah, who seemed oblivious to the undertone in their uncle's words. "What purpose is that, Uncle?" Rebecca asked, speaking up for the first time in several minutes. Blackwood's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back. "All in good time, my dear. For now, let us simply say that God has blessed our family with certain qualities that must be preserved, qualities that have made us prosperous and influential." After dinner, the Reverend invited his nieces to join him in his study, a wood-paneled room lined with books and dominated by a large desk. Behind it hung a painting of Christ on the cross. the artist having captured an unsettling expression that seemed more triumphant than suffering. "Your mother may not have prepared you for the realities of plantation management," Blackwood said, as he poured himself a brandy. "But as my heirs, you must begin to understand our operations." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "Are we truly to be your heirs, Uncle? Mother never specified the details of your arrangement." "Indeed you are," he confirmed. "The Blackwood estate will pass to both of you upon my death, assuming, of course, that you fulfill your duties to the family legacy." Rebecca frowned slightly. "What duties would those be?" Blackwood settled into his chair, regarding them thoughtfully. "The Blackwood name carries weight in Georgia. Our bloodline is untainted, strong. We must ensure it remains so." He paused, taking a sip of brandy. "In time, you'll understand the full scope of what I mean. For now, observe and learn how salvation operates." The conversation shifted to the practical aspects of plantation management, crop production, slave discipline, and the Reverend's unique approach to breeding. He spoke of it clinically, as if discussing livestock. "Healthy slaves produce healthy offspring," he explained. "I've developed a scientific approach to breeding that has resulted in some of the strongest field hands in the state. Other planters pay premium prices for salvation-bred slaves." Rebecca felt nausea rising in her throat, but forced herself to maintain a composed expression. Sarah, meanwhile, nodded with interest, seemingly untroubled by their uncle's cold calculation. As they prepared to retire for the evening, Blackwood laid a hand on each of their shoulders. "Tomorrow, I'll show you the full operation. It's important you understand what God has entrusted to our care." His grip tightened slightly. "We are his instruments in maintaining the natural order, my dears. Never forget that." That night, Rebecca found sleep elusive. Her room, though luxurious, felt stifling. The sounds of the plantation at night filtered through her window, distant voices, the occasional crack of a whip, and once a cry that made her blood run cold. Around midnight, a soft knock at her door startled her fully awake. Expecting Sarah, she was surprised to find the same slave girl who had caught her attention at dinner. "Miss Rebecca," the girl whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. "My name is Naomi. I knew your mother." Rebecca pulled her inside quickly, closing the door. "What do you mean? How did you know my mother?" Naomi's eyes darted around the room before settling on Rebecca's face. "Your mother visited here twice a year. She didn't approve of what happens at Salvation. Before she died, she made me promise to watch over her daughters if they ever came here." "What happens here?" Rebecca asked, though a part of her already suspected. "Things no God-fearing person would permit," Naomi replied, her voice barely audible. "Your uncle calls it God's will, but there's nothing holy about it." She hesitated before continuing. "Miss Elizabeth, your mother, she tried to expose him once. That's why he kept her away from the plantation for so many years." Rebecca sank onto the edge of her bed. "And now he's brought us here. Why?" "The Blackwood bloodline," Naomi said, the words sounding like a curse on her lips. "He believes it's sacred, chosen by God to rule over others. He needs heirs to continue his work." A cold realization began to dawn on Rebecca. "But he already has heirs. Sarah and me." Naomi's expression confirmed her worst fears. "Not just heirs, Miss Rebecca. Vessels. The Reverend needs the Blackwood blood to remain pure. And with your mother gone..." Rebecca felt the room spin around her. That's unthinkable. He's our uncle. Surely even he wouldn't." "He believes God speaks directly to him," Naomi said simply. "He believes everything he does is sanctified by divine will." She moved toward the door. "I've risked much telling you this. Watch your sister carefully. The Reverend finds her more amenable to his influence." Before leaving, Naomi pressed a small object into Rebecca's palm, a key. "This opens the cabinet in your mother's old room, the east attic. There's something there she wanted you to find if you ever came here." With that, she slipped out, leaving Rebecca alone with terrible suspicions and a key that seemed to burn in her hand. The following morning dawned bright and clear, But for Rebecca, the beauty of the Georgia sunrise was tainted by what she'd learned. At breakfast, she observed her uncle with new eyes, noting the way his gaze lingered on Sarah, the subtle ways he established dominance and control. "Today," Blackwood announced, "we begin your education in earnest. Isaiah will show you the fields and processing areas this morning. This afternoon, I'll personally guide you through our breeding program, which is the true foundation of Salvation's success." Sarah nodded eagerly while Rebecca struggled to maintain her composure. She needed to find a way to access the East Attic and discover what her mother had left behind. More importantly, she needed to determine if Naomi's warnings were true, and if so, how to protect herself and her sister from what awaited them at Salvation. As they prepared to leave for the tour, Rebecca caught sight of Naomi working in the hallway. Their eyes met briefly, a silent communication passing between them. Whatever darkness lurked at Salvation, Rebecca was beginning to realize she had an ally, and perhaps a path to uncovering the truth behind her uncle's disturbing vision of God's will. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on the red Georgia soil as Isaiah led the Blackwood nieces across the vast plantation. The overseer's weathered face remained impassive as he pointed out various operations, the cotton fields stretching to the horizon, the processing sheds where slaves separated seeds from fiber, the smokehouse and vegetable gardens that sustained the plantation's population. "Salvation produces over 200 bales of cotton annually," Isaiah explained with evident pride. "More than any other plantation in the county, the Reverend's methods ensure maximum productivity." Sarah nodded appreciatively, shading her eyes with a lace-trimmed hand as she surveyed what would one day be partly hers. Rebecca, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the apparent orderliness of the operation with the undercurrent of dread she'd felt since their arrival. "And how many slaves does my uncle own?" Rebecca asked, her voice carefully neutral. Isaiah turned his cold gaze toward her. "The Reverend prefers the term servants, Miss Rebecca. He owns the labor of 173 souls, not counting new acquisitions or those currently in development." The euphemism made Rebecca's skin crawl. "In development?" "The unborn," Isaiah clarified without emotion. "The Reverend's breeding program typically has 15 to 20 expectant mothers at any given time." Sarah looked intrigued, rather than disturbed. "How fascinating. Uncle mentioned his scientific approach last night. Is that part of what we'll see this afternoon?" "Indeed, Miss Sarah. The Reverend believes you both should understand all aspects of plantation management." Isaiah's eyes lingered on Sarah with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite decipher. The breeding barns are his particular pride. As they continued their tour, Rebecca observed the slaves working in the fields. Unlike some plantations she'd glimpsed during their journey from Savannah, the field hands at Salvation didn't bear the extensive scarring typical of excessive whipping. Instead, they moved with a strange, mechanical precision, eyes downcast, voices silent except when responding to overseers. "They're so quiet," Rebecca remarked as they passed a group harvesting early cotton. "I've heard field work is typically accompanied by singing." Isaiah's mouth tightened. "The Reverend doesn't permit unnecessary noise. He believes it encourages idleness and independent thought." He gestured toward a small building set apart from the others. "That's the chapel where your uncle conducts daily services for the servants. His teachings emphasize the divine order, masters above slaves, men above women, the Blackwood name above all others." They paused at the edge of a field where a group of men were breaking new ground for planting. Their muscles strained against the unyielding earth, sweat pouring down their backs despite the early hour. "These are all from the Reverend's special line," Isaiah noted with the clinical detachment of a horse breeder. "Fourth-generation Salvation bred. Note the uniformity of build, the stamina. The Reverend has eliminated weakness from their bloodline through careful selection." Rebecca felt bile rising in her throat, but forced herself to maintain composure. "And do these men have families? Wives? Children?" Isaiah gave her a curious look. They mate according to the Reverend's selections, if that's what you're asking. Family attachments are discouraged as they interfere with productivity and breeding goals. I see, Rebecca murmured, though what she was seeing horrified her more with each passing minute. Sarah, apparently oblivious to her sister's discomfort, asked detailed questions about crop yields and market prices that Isaiah seemed pleased to answer. The overseer clearly viewed the elder Blackwood niece as a worthy heir to the plantation's legacy. Their tour concluded at the main barn, where the newest acquisitions were being processed. Men and women, separated by gender, stood in lines as plantation slaves examined them for illness or injury. All had been stripped to the waist, regardless of gender, their dignity sacrificed to efficiency. Fresh from the Charleston market, Isaiah explained, the Reverend personally selected them for integration into our breeding lines. The strongest will be paired with our established bloodlines. Any deemed unsuitable will be trained for housework or sold to neighboring plantations. Rebecca couldn't bear to watch the humiliating inspections. She turned away, only to find herself facing a small building set apart from the others. Unlike the whitewashed structures of the main plantation, this building was made of rough-hewn logs, with a single heavy door reinforced with iron. "What's that?" she asked, desperate to direct attention away from the human cattle market behind her. Isaiah's expression darkened. "That's not part of today's tour, Miss Rebecca. That building is for correction of those who resist the Reverend's divine order." Before she could inquire further, they were interrupted by the arrival of a young slave boy, no more than 10, who approached Isaiah with evident terror. "Mr. Isaiah, sir," the child stammered, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. "The Reverend sends word that he's ready for the young ladies to join him for midday meal before the afternoon tour." Isaiah nodded curtly. "Tell the Reverend we'll return directly." As the boy scurried away, he turned to Sarah and Rebecca. "The Reverend is eager to show you the breeding program himself. It's his life's work." The midday meal was served on the rear veranda, offering views of the manicured gardens that surrounded the main house, a stark contrast to the utilitarian organization of the working plantation. Reverend Blackwood was already seated when the sisters arrived, a Bible open beside his plate. "Ah, my dear nieces," he greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I trust Isaiah has given you a comprehensive tour of our operation?" "It's most impressive, Uncle," Sarah replied, taking her seat. "The organization, the efficiency, it's unlike anything I've seen before." Rebecca said nothing, struggling to meet her uncle's gaze. The morning's observations had only deepened her unease, and Naomi's warnings echoed in her mind. "You're quiet, Rebecca," Blackwood observed, his tone carrying a slight edge. "Did something about the tour disturb you?" She forced herself to look up, to match his intensity with her own. "I'm simply processing all I've seen, Uncle. The scale of salvation is overwhelming." "Indeed it is," he agreed, seemingly satisfied with her response. "What man has built here is but a pale reflection of God's greater design. Order, hierarchy, purpose, these are divine principles made manifest through our work." Throughout the meal, Blackwood expounded on his philosophy, weaving together scripture and racial theory in a way that presented slavery not merely as an economic necessity, but as a divine mandate. He quoted passages selectively, emphasizing obedience and the natural order of creation. "The errors of modern thinking," he proclaimed, butterknife pointing skyward, "stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of God's design. Equality is a pernicious myth. In heaven as on earth, there is rank and station. The Blackwood name stands near the pinnacle of that divine hierarchy." As servants cleared the dishes, Blackwood's attention focused on Sarah. "Your mother wrote that you excel in scripture study, my dear. I hope you'll join me in leading evening devotionals for the household staff." Sarah beamed with pride. "I would be honored, Uncle. Mother always said my understanding of scripture was beyond my years." Elizabeth was right about that, it seems, Blackwood nodded approvingly, though she and I differed on certain interpretations. Rebecca seized the opening. How did you and Mother differ, Uncle? She rarely spoke of doctrinal matters with us. A shadow crossed Blackwood's face. Your mother was influenced by dangerous ideas during her time in Savannah. She forgot the importance of bloodline and divine order. It caused a regrettable estrangement between us. He dabbed his lips with a napkin before continuing. But God has seen fit to return her daughters to salvation, where the Blackwood legacy can continue as he intended. The implication in his words sent a chill through Rebecca. She glanced at Sarah, who seemed oblivious to any subtext in their uncle's statement. After the meal, Blackwood led them toward a cluster of buildings set apart from the main plantation operations. Unlike the rough utility of the field slaves' quarters, these structures were well maintained, with solid construction and even small gardens surrounding them. This is the heart of salvation, Blackwood announced with evident pride. What sets our operation apart from all others in Georgia? Our breeding program. The largest building resembled a hospital ward more than a slave quarters. Inside, rows of beds lined the walls, each occupied by a pregnant woman in various stages of expectancy. Female slaves in clean aprons moved among them, checking their condition and offering water. Each mother is carefully selected for health, intelligence, and conformity, Blackwood explained, moving through the room with the confidence of a physician. The pregnant women averted their eyes as he passed, some placing protective hands over their swollen bellies. Diet, exercise, and spiritual instruction are all monitored to ensure optimal development. Rebecca forced herself to ask the question foremost in her mind. And the fathers? Are they similarly selected? Blackwood's eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement. Indeed, we maintain detailed records of lineage, traits, and productivity. Nothing is left to chance or base instinct. Every pairing is designed to strengthen the bloodline. The bloodline, Rebecca repeated. You mean the slave's bloodline? Primarily, he replied with a slight smile, though the principle applies universally. Blood tells, Rebecca. It carries the essence of what we are, our strengths, our weaknesses, our divine purpose. As they continued through the building, Rebecca noticed a separate section behind a locked door. When Blackwood opened it, she was startled to see several young women who appeared to be of mixed race, their skin tones varying from light brown to a complexion that could almost pass for white. "Our special project," Blackwood said in a lower voice. These women represent the culmination of careful selection over generations. Some possess as much as 1/8 white blood. Blackwood blood, specifically. Sarah gasped. Uncle, do you mean to say that my father and grandfather understood the importance of personally strengthening the bloodlines? Yes, he showed no shame in the admission. The results speak for themselves. These women bring the highest prices at market, though I rarely sell them. They're far more valuable as breeding stock. Rebecca felt faint, the full horror of her uncle's program becoming clear. Not just a scientific approach to slave breeding, but a deliberate effort to inject Blackwood blood into his human property, a grotesque parody of family creation. And you? Rebecca managed to ask, though she dreaded the answer. Do you also contribute to this program, Uncle? Blackwood regarded her with an expression that mixed amusement and warning. When necessary, but I'm getting older, Rebecca. The future of salvation requires new stewards of the bloodline. His gaze moved between the sisters. The Blackwood legacy must continue, pure and undiluted. That's why your presence here is so important. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Rebecca felt Sarah stiffen beside her, the first indication that her sister might finally be comprehending their uncle's intentions. They completed the tour in silence, viewing the separate quarters for male breeding stock and the nursery where infants were cared for by older female slaves. Throughout, Blackwood spoke with the detached interest of a scientist describing an experiment rather than a man discussing human beings. As they walked back toward the main house, the sun beginning its westward descent, Blackwood placed a hand on each niece's shoulder. "Now you understand what sets salvation apart, what your mother rejected, to her eternal regret." "Udo, what exactly did Mother reject?" Rebecca asked, unable to contain the question any longer. Blackwood's grip tightened painfully. "Her responsibility to the bloodline. Elizabeth was to marry my younger brother, continue the pure Blackwood line. Instead, she fled to Savannah and married beneath her station." His voice hardened. "But God has given us a second chance through you, her daughters. Half Blackwood, but still carrying the divine essence." That evening, dinner was a subdued affair. Sarah, unusually quiet, excused herself early, claiming a headache from the day's activities. Rebecca, desperate to check the east attic but unwilling to arouse suspicion, forced herself to engage with her uncle's conversation until an appropriate hour to retire. When she finally reached her room, she found Sarah waiting for her, pacing the floor in agitation. "Did you understand what he was suggesting today?" Sarah demanded without preamble. "What he intends for us?" Rebecca closed the door carefully before answering. "I believe he intends us to join his breeding program, not as administrators, but as participants." Sarah's face paled. "With him? Our own uncle? To keep the bloodline pure," Rebecca confirmed, the words tasting like poison. "Naomi warned me last night. She knew Mother. The house slave? When did you speak with her?" Sarah's distress momentarily gave way to confusion. Rebecca quickly explained Naomi's midnight visit and the key she'd been given. "Mother left something for us in the east attic. We need to find it tonight, while Uncle is occupied with his evening devotionals." Sarah sank onto the bed, shaking her head. "This is madness, Rebecca. Uncle Elijah is a respected minister, a community leader. Surely we've misunderstood." "You saw the breeding barns," Rebecca insisted. "You heard how he spoke of bloodlines and divine purpose. He believes what he's doing is sanctioned by God, perhaps even commanded by him." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. "Very well. We'll check the attic. But we must be careful. If we're wrong about his intentions, making such accusations could ruin us." They waited until the sounds of singing drifted up from the first floor, indicating that evening devotionals were underway. Moving silently through the darkened corridors, they reached the narrow staircase leading to the east attic. The space was stifling, the summer heat trapped under the roof, making it difficult to breathe. Dust motes danced in the beam of the small lamp they'd brought, illuminating trunks and furniture draped in sheets like ghosts of the past. "Mother's room would have been here," Rebecca whispered, moving toward a section where a small window let in a sliver of moonlight. A cabinet stood against the wall, its dark wood ornately carved with biblical scenes: the Garden of Eden, the Flood, the Tower of Babel. The key Naomi had provided fit perfectly. Inside, they found a leather-bound journal and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. Sarah held the lamp closer as Rebecca opened the journal, revealing their mother's elegant handwriting. "It's dated nearly 20 years ago," Rebecca noted, scanning the first pages, "when Mother was not much older than I am now." The journal detailed Elizabeth Blackwood's growing horror as she discovered the true nature of her brother's breeding program, not just the scientific approach to slave breeding, but his personal participation and twisted religious justification. "He believes the Blackwood line is divinely chosen," Rebecca read aloud, her voice trembling. "That mixing our blood with slaves creates a superior servant, one who will understand their place in God's order through the very blood in their veins. Elijah says Father taught him this purpose, but I cannot believe our father would condone such blasphemy." Later entries described Elizabeth's discovery that she herself had been promised to their younger brother, Thomas, in an arrangement made by their father to preserve the bloodline. Her escape to Savannah and marriage to a merchant named Harrison had been an act of desperate rebellion. The final breach came when I confronted Elijah about the children. One entry read, "Not just the mixed-blood slaves, but the others, the ones who showed too much resemblance to the Blackwood features and are quietly disposed of." He spoke of them as failed experiments rather than innocent souls. I knew then that salvation was no longer a plantation, but a place of abomination dressed in scripture. Sarah's hands shook as she untied the packet of letters. "These are from our father," she murmured, scanning the first few. "Warning Mother never to return to salvation. He feared Uncle Elijah would take us from them if he knew of our existence. And now we're here, delivered into his hands by Mother's death," Rebecca said bitterly. "Exactly what they feared." The final letter in the packet was different from the others, written in a shaky hand on poor quality paper. It was signed simply, "Ruth." "I write this knowing the risk," it began. "Your brother has forbidden all mention of your name, but some of us remember your kindness. What happens here has grown worse since your departure. The Reverend claims God speaks to him directly, commanding him to create a new order through the Blackwood blood. Those who resist are taken to the correction house and do not return the same, if they return at all." The letter continued with disturbing details of Blackwood's special breeding program and his growing obsession with blood purity. It concluded with a warning. "If fate ever brings your daughters to salvation, hide them. The Reverend speaks often of the need for pure vessels to continue the Blackwood line, and I fear what that would mean for your girls." Rebecca closed the journal with trembling hands. "We need to leave this place, tonight if possible." Sarah, her face ashen, nodded in agreement. "But how? We're miles from town, and Uncle controls every aspect of the plantation." "Naomi," Rebecca decided. "She risked herself to warn me. She might know a way out." They carefully replaced the journal and letters, locking the cabinet before making their way back downstairs. The devotionals were ending, slaves filing silently back to their quarters under the watchful eyes of overseers. As they reached the second-floor landing, Reverend Blackwood's voice called up from below. "Sarah, Rebecca, join me in my study. There's something important we must discuss." The sisters exchanged frightened glances. There was no way to avoid the summons without raising suspicion, and they needed time to plan their escape. "Coming, Uncle," Sarah called down, her voice remarkably steady despite her fear. She squeezed Rebecca's hand. "We'll find a way out," she whispered, "but for now we must play along." And together they descended the stairs toward their uncle's study, where the true purpose of their presence at salvation awaited them, and where they would need every ounce of courage to resist becoming the next vessels for Elijah Blackwood's twisted vision of God's will. The study door closed behind them with a sound like a prison gate sliding shut. Rebecca felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Reverend Blackwood gestured for the sisters to sit in the leather chairs facing his massive desk. Behind him, the painting of Christ seemed to watch them with the same unsettling intensity as their uncle. "You visited the East Attic," Blackwood stated simply, not a question, but an accusation delivered with chilling certainty. Rebecca froze, but Sarah responded with remarkable composure. "We were exploring our new home, Uncle. Mother spoke so often of her childhood here." Blackwood's expression remained unreadable as he poured 3 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Your mother had a romantic view of salvation that blinded her to its true purpose." He placed glasses before each of them. "Drink. We have matters of grave importance to discuss." Rebecca left her glass untouched, but Sarah, perhaps seeking liquid courage, took a small sip. The Reverend settled into his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied them. "Did you find Elizabeth's journal?" he asked abruptly. The direct question left no room for denial. Rebecca nodded silently, watching his reaction. "I suspected she kept one." Blackwood sighed. "Elizabeth always had a tendency toward excessive documentation. A shame she misinterpreted what she saw here." "Misinterpreted?" Rebecca couldn't contain her disbelief. "She wrote about your breeding program, about your personal involvement in it. About your plans for her. Yes, plans ordained by our Father and sanctified by divine purpose, Blackwood replied calmly. Elizabeth rejected her destiny, just as Esau rejected his birthright. But God has provided a second chance through you. Sarah's hand trembled as she set down her glass. Uncle, surely you can't mean— I mean precisely what you fear, he interrupted. The Blackwood bloodline must remain pure to fulfill its divine purpose. Your mother's marriage diluted that purity, but not beyond redemption. Through careful management, we can restore what was lost. Management, Rebecca repeated, disgust evident in her voice. You're speaking of incest, of rape. There's nothing divine about it. Blackwood's expression hardened. You speak of earthly concerns and human laws. I answer to a higher authority. He stood, moving to a bookshelf where he retrieved a leather-bound volume different from the Bible he usually carried. This is the Blackwood Covenant, begun by your great-grandfather and continued through generations. It documents our family's special relationship with God and his purpose for our bloodline. He opened the book, revealing pages of handwritten text interspersed with family trees and what appeared to be breeding records. For 6 generations, the Blackwood line has been carefully maintained. Your mother's defiance was the first breach in our covenant. And what exactly is this covenant? Rebecca demanded, struggling to keep her voice steady. What possible purpose could God have for such abomination? Creation of a higher order, Blackwood replied, his voice taking on the cadence of his sermons. Through careful selection and divine guidance, we are creating servants who understand their place in God's hierarchy through the very blood in their veins. And above them, a pure Blackwood line to oversee God's plan. Sarah had gone pale, her earlier composure crumbling. You want us to bear your children? In time, Blackwood nodded, as if discussing something as mundane as dinner plans. But first, you must be properly educated in our ways. Sarah, your understanding of Scripture shows promise. Rebecca, your skepticism must be overcome through proper instruction. Rebecca felt a surge of rage cut through her fear. You're insane. What you're describing isn't God's will. It's the ravings of a madman justifying his own depravity. Instead of anger, Blackwood's face showed something like pity. Your mother's influence, I see. She always encouraged independent thinking, a dangerous trait in women. He closed the Blackwood Covenant with deliberate care. You'll both begin intensive scripture study tomorrow. In the meantime, you'll remain in your rooms for your own safety. The transition to salvation can be disorienting for newcomers. He pulled a bell rope, and moments later Isaiah appeared at the door. The young ladies are overtired from their tour today, Blackwood informed him. Please escort them to their rooms and ensure they remain there until morning devotionals. As they were led upstairs, Rebecca's mind raced. Their situation had gone from disturbing to desperate in a matter of hours. They needed to escape, and soon, before Blackwood could implement the next phase of his plans. Isaiah positioned himself at the end of the hallway after locking each sister in her separate room. Rebecca paced the floor, searching frantically for any possible escape route. The windows offered little hope, a sheer drop to the ground 2 stories below, with no convenient trellises or trees to aid a descent. As midnight approached, she heard a faint scratching at her door. Pressing her ear against the wood, she whispered, "Who's there?" "It's Naomi," came the barely audible reply. "I've brought you food and news." "The door is locked from the outside," Rebecca said desperately. "Not anymore," Naomi responded. There was a soft click, and the door opened just enough for the slave woman to slip inside, carrying a small bundle and what appeared to be a hairpin. "How did you—" Rebecca began. "I've worked in this house since I was a child," Naomi interrupted, handing over the bundle. "There are few locks I can't open, but we must be quick. Isaiah checks the hallway every half hour." Rebecca unwrapped the bundle to find bread, cheese, and a small flask of water. "Thank you," she said, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. "But we need more than food." We need to escape, tonight if possible. Naomi shook her head. Not tonight. The Reverend has doubled the night patrols since your arrival. He anticipated resistance. She lowered her voice further. But there's an opportunity coming. In 3 days, the Reverend travels to Augusta for the Regional Ministerial Conference. He'll take Isaiah and several overseers with him. 3 days, Rebecca repeated, dismayed. Can we afford to wait that long? You have little choice, Naomi replied bluntly, and you'll need time to prepare. The journey to safety is not an easy one. Rebecca realized there was more to Naomi's knowledge than simple household awareness. You've helped others escape before, haven't you? A shadow crossed the woman's face. I've tried. Some succeeded. Others... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Your mother funded an escape network before she left Salvation. Some of us have maintained it at great risk. Hope flared in Rebecca's chest. Then there is a way out. A dangerous way, Naomi cautioned. But yes, when the time comes, look for a field hand named Moses. He'll guide you to the first safe house. She moved toward the door, pausing to press something into Rebecca's hand, another hairpin. For your sister's door. Convince her tonight if you can. The Reverend has already begun working on her mind. After Naomi departed, Rebecca waited until the hallway fell silent before using the hairpin to unlock her door. Moving silently in her nightgown, she made her way to Sarah's room and repeated the process. Sarah was sitting by the window when Rebecca entered, her face illuminated by moonlight. She looked up without surprise. I wondered if you'd find a way in. We need to plan our escape, Rebecca said without preamble. Naomi says there's a route, but we can't attempt it until Uncle leaves for Augusta in 3 days. Sarah turned back to the window. And go where, Rebecca? Back to Savannah, where we have no home and no protection. Mother's will placed us under Uncle Elijah's guardianship until we marry or turn 21. Anywhere is better than here, Rebecca insisted, sitting beside her sister. You can't possibly be considering staying. Of course not, Sarah replied sharply. But we need more than an escape plan. We need proof of what's happening here. Otherwise, it's merely our word against a respected minister's. Rebecca hadn't considered this aspect. In their social world, 2 young women making accusations against a male relative would face significant skepticism, especially without evidence. Mother's journal shows her suspicions, but not proof, Sarah interrupted. We need documentation of Uncle's program in his own hand, the Blackwood Covenant he showed us. You're suggesting we steal it? I'm suggesting we copy key passages at minimum, Sarah replied, and perhaps locate any records he keeps of his special breeding program. With sufficient evidence, we could approach the authorities in Savannah, where Uncle has less influence. Rebecca was surprised by her sister's strategic thinking. Sarah had always been the more conventional of the two, more concerned with social standing than moral complexities. That's actually brilliant, Sarah. But how? We're locked in at night, watched during the day. Uncle believes I'm more amenable to his influence, Sarah said with a grim smile. I'll encourage that belief. Express interest in his teachings. Request access to the covenant for study. Meanwhile, you should focus on finding a way to signal this Moses person and prepare for our departure. The sisters spent the next hour refining their plan. Agreeing to communicate through notes hidden in a loose floorboard Rebecca discovered beneath the rug in her room. As the half-hour approached and Isaiah's footsteps echoed in the hallway, Rebecca slipped back to her own room, both terrified and oddly hopeful for the first time since arriving at Salvation. The following morning, Reverend Blackwood summoned them to the small plantation chapel for what he called preliminary instruction. The building, though modest from the outside, contained elaborate woodwork within, pews carved with biblical scenes similar to those on the cabinet in the attic, a pulpit resembling a judge's bench more than a traditional lectern. Salvation's spiritual foundation, Blackwood explained as they entered, is as carefully constructed as its physical one. He gestured to the empty pews. The servants receive daily instruction here, learning their place in God's design. The walls were decorated with painted scenes from Scripture, but Rebecca noticed they all emphasized themes of obedience, punishment, and divine hierarchy. The Israelites bowing before Moses, Abraham preparing to sacrifice Isaac, Christ washing the disciples' feet, all depicted with an emphasis on submission to authority. "Today we begin with the cornerstone of understanding," Blackwood announced, placing a Bible on the pulpit. "Genesis, the creation of divine order and the establishment of dominion." For the next 2 hours, he lectured on his interpretation of creation, emphasizing repeatedly how God established hierarchies from the beginning: heaven above earth, man above animals, Adam above Eve. Throughout, he wove in references to bloodlines and inheritance, citing Cain and Abel, Esau and Jacob, Joseph and his brothers. "The Bible is fundamentally a book of bloodlines," he insisted. "From Adam to Noah, Abraham to David, and ultimately to Christ himself. God works through chosen lineages, selecting and purifying them for his purpose." Sarah demonstrated remarkable acting ability, asking questions that suggested growing acceptance of Blackwood's twisted theology. Rebecca remained mostly silent, afraid her disgust would show through any attempted engagement. After the morning's instruction, Blackwood invited Sarah to join him in his study to examine some of his theological references, pointedly excluding Rebecca. "Your sister requires more basic preparation," he explained, with thinly veiled condescension. "Isaiah will show you the proper texts in the library, Rebecca." The library proved to be a small room adjacent to Blackwood's study, containing carefully selected religious works that supported his worldview. Isaiah stood guard at the door, while Rebecca pretended to read, her mind actually focused on potential escape routes and ways to contact the mysterious Moses. Through the wall, she could faintly hear Sarah's voice engaging Blackwood in theological discussion, occasionally asking about the Blackwood covenant with seemingly innocent curiosity. The sound of her sister voluntarily spending time with the man who planned to violate them both made Rebecca's skin crawl, even knowing it was strategic. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. Mornings were devoted to Blackwood's instruction, afternoons to separate study. Each night, the sisters met in secret, sharing what they'd learned and refining their escape plan. Sarah had managed to gain limited access to the covenant, memorizing passages and copying what she could during moments when Blackwood was called away from his study. "It's worse than we imagined," she whispered on the second night. "The breeding program has been ongoing for generations. Grandfather began it, but Uncle Elijah expanded it significantly. There are detailed records of every pairing, every birth, every Blackwood contribution to the bloodline. And he documents this openly? Isn't he concerned about authorities discovering it?" Rebecca asked. Sarah's laugh was hollow. "What authorities? The local magistrate is his second cousin. The sheriff attends his church. Besides, the most damning details are written in a code of sorts, biblical references and euphemisms that only make sense if you understand the underlying philosophy." On the third day, Blackwood announced his impending trip to Augusta. "I'll be gone for 2 days," he informed them at breakfast. "In my absence, you'll continue your studies under Martha's supervision. Isaiah will accompany me, but several overseers remain to maintain order." "We'll miss your guidance, Uncle," Sarah said with perfectly feigned disappointment. "Perhaps you could leave us portions of the covenant to study while you're away?" "I found the genealogical sections particularly illuminating." Blackwood beamed with approval. "Your interest warms my heart, Sarah. So different from your mother's stubborn resistance." He patted her hand in a gesture that made Rebecca want to scream. "I'll select appropriate passages for your consideration." That evening, as Blackwood prepared for his journey, Rebecca managed a brief moment alone with Naomi, while the slave woman helped her dress for dinner. "Tomorrow night," Naomi whispered, arranging Rebecca's hair. "After the evening bell, look for Moses at the edge of the north cotton field, beyond the old oak. Bring only what you can carry easily and wear dark clothing. We'll be there, Rebecca promised. But Naomi, what about you? Come with us. The woman shook her head sadly. My children and grandchildren are here. I cannot leave them. She secured a final pin in Rebecca's hair. But I can help others find freedom, as your mother once helped me try to save my eldest daughter. Her eyes grew distant. She made it to Pennsylvania. At least, that's what we heard. That hope sustains me. At dinner, Blackwood was in unusually high spirits, pleased with Sarah's apparent progress, and looking forward to sharing his theological innovations with colleagues in Augusta. He even treated Rebecca with less suspicion, interpreting her quiet demeanor as submission rather than calculated restraint. When I return, he announced as they finished dessert, we'll begin the next phase of your integration into salvation's purpose. The fall planting season approaches, and with it, traditional ceremonies of renewal and commitment. The implications sent a chill through Rebecca, but Sarah maintained her facade of interest. What ceremonies are these, Uncle? Mother never mentioned them. Elizabeth left before her own ceremony could take place, Blackwood replied, with a slight frown. But as her daughters, you'll fulfill the covenant she rejected. The Blackwood bloodline will be renewed through you, purified and strengthened for generations to come. Rebecca forced herself to sip her water, fighting the urge to throw it in her uncle's face. One more night, she reminded herself. One more day of pretense, and then they would flee this place of horrors. Later that evening, Blackwood departed for Augusta with Isaiah and 2 other trusted overseers. The sisters watched from their window as the carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, taking with it the plantation's most vigilant eyes. We need to finalize our preparations, Sarah whispered, pulling Rebecca away from the window. I've copied the most damning passages from the covenant, but we need more, especially records of his special breeding program. How? The study will be locked in his absence. Sarah produced a key from her pocket with a triumphant smile, taken from his desk drawer when he was called away to deal with a dispute among the field hands. He has so many keys, he's unlikely to notice one missing until he returns. Rebecca stared at her sister in amazement. Sarah Blackwood, I never knew you had such talents for deception. Neither did I, Sarah admitted with a grim smile. Perhaps there's more Blackwood in me than I care to admit, though put to better purpose, I hope. They waited until the household settled for the night before using Sarah's stolen key to enter Blackwood's study. Working by the light of a single candle, they searched through drawers and cabinets, looking for additional documentation of the breeding program. Here, Sarah whispered, pulling a ledger from a hidden compartment in the desk. This is what we need. The book contained meticulous records of Blackwood's special pairings, clinical descriptions of forced breeding between slaves with Blackwood blood and their subsequent offspring. Most disturbing were entries in Blackwood's own hand, describing his personal contributions and evaluations of the resulting children. Some show excessive Blackwood traits and must be removed from the program, one entry read. Facial resemblance too pronounced for safety. Arranged sale to Wilkinson Plantation in Alabama. Rebecca felt physically ill reading the entries. This is enough. More than enough. Copy what you can, and let's return to our rooms. Sarah worked quickly, transcribing key passages onto paper they'd hidden in their clothing. When she finished, they carefully replaced the ledger and relocked the study, returning to their rooms without detection. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Martha, the head house slave, supervised their studies with a rigid adherence to Blackwood's instructions, unaware that the sisters' apparent compliance masked their imminent flight. As evening approached, Rebecca and Sarah prepared their meager bundles, a change of clothes, the copied documents, and what little money they had brought from Savannah. They dressed in their darkest gowns, with shawls to cover their distinctive hair. "Are you afraid?" Sarah asked as they waited for the evening bell to signal the end of the workday. "Terrified," Rebecca admitted, "but not as afraid as I am of staying." The bell rang out across the plantation at sundown. The sisters waited until the house grew quiet, most of the staff occupied with evening meal preparations, before slipping out through a side door, rarely used except for bringing in firewood. Darkness had fallen completely by the time they reached the north cotton field. The old oak Naomi had mentioned stood like a sentinel at its edge, branches reaching toward a sky studded with stars. "Do you see anyone?" Sarah whispered, clutching Rebecca's arm. Before Rebecca could answer, a deep voice spoke from the shadows. "The Lord helps those who help themselves." A tall figure emerged, a broad-shouldered man whose face remained partially obscured by the darkness. "I'm Moses," he said simply. "Naomi sent word you'd be coming. We need to move quickly before they discover you're gone." Without waiting for response, he turned and began walking toward the woods beyond the field. The sisters followed, leaving behind the only security they had known since their mother's death, headed into an uncertain future, but one free from Elijah Blackwood's twisted vision of God's will. The forest swallowed them in darkness so complete that Rebecca could barely see Moses's broad back a few feet ahead. The only sounds were their cautious footsteps on the pine needle floor and the sisters' ragged breathing as they struggled to keep pace with their guide. The humid night air clung to their skin, and insects hummed around them, creating a constant disorienting chorus. "Stay close," Moses whispered over his shoulder. "The path is narrow, and there are patrols even with the Reverend away." They had been walking for nearly an hour, following what seemed to be an invisible trail through the dense Georgia woods. Rebecca's skirts had caught on brambles multiple times, and Sarah had stumbled twice, barely catching herself before falling. Their fine leather shoes, designed for savannah drawing rooms rather than wilderness escape, were already showing signs of wear. "How much farther?" Sarah whispered, her voice strained with exhaustion. "First safe house is 3 miles from Salvation," Moses replied without slowing. "We're halfway there." Rebecca squeezed her sister's hand encouragingly. Every step took them further from Elijah Blackwood's reach, from his perverse plans for their bodies and bloodline. Whatever hardships lay ahead on their journey, they couldn't be worse than what awaited if they remained. Suddenly, Moses froze, raising his hand in warning. The sisters halted immediately, straining their ears for whatever had alarmed their guide. Then Rebecca heard it. Voices in the distance, accompanied by the distinctive baying of hounds. "They've discovered you're missing," Moses whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Sooner than expected." Fear clutched at Rebecca's heart. "What do we do?" Moses scanned the darkness, clearly calculating their options. "Change of plan. The main route will be watched now." He pointed to a barely visible path branching to their left. "That way leads to the swamp. Harder going, but the water will throw off the dogs." "The swamp?" Sarah repeated, unable to keep the dismay from her voice. "But our shoes, our dresses." "Your lives," Moses cut her off sharply. "Choose." Ooh. Without further debate, they turned onto the new path, moving as quickly as the increasingly muddy ground allowed. The forest gradually gave way to cypress trees draped with Spanish moss, their gnarled roots erupting from stagnant water that reflected the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Stay on the high ground when you can," Moses instructed, pointing out barely visible ridges in the swampy terrain. "Step where I step." The baying of hounds grew louder, then fainter as their scent trail was broken by the first pools of standing water they were forced to wade through. The water was shockingly cold despite the summer heat, and Rebecca tried not to think about what creatures might be sharing it with them. After what seemed like hours of slogging through increasingly deep water and clinging mud, Moses guided them onto a small island of relatively dry ground. In the center stood a crude shelter, little more than a lean-to made of cypress branches and palmetto leaves. "Rest here," he said, gesturing toward the shelter. "They won't search this deep in the swamp until daylight." Sarah collapsed onto the relatively dry ground beneath the shelter, her once fine dress now sodden and torn, streaked with mud and cypress stain. Rebecca joined her, feeling the fatigue of their flight in every muscle. "Who are you?" Rebecca asked Moses as he kept watch at the edge of their small sanctuary. "How do you know these paths?" Moses turned toward them, his face now visible in a shaft of moonlight breaking through the trees. Rebecca gasped softly at the network of scars visible on his cheek and neck, old whip marks that told their own story of plantation justice. "I was born at Salvation," he said simply. "Third generation of the Reverend's special program. My grandmother was one of the first." The implications took a moment to register. "You're Blackwood blood," he confirmed, his tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Enough to give me his height, not enough to show in my skin." He turned his gaze back toward the darkness. "Enough to make me valuable, not enough to make me human in his eyes. And you help others escape," Sarah said, understanding dawning, "despite the risk." "Because of it," Moses corrected. "I've seen what happens at Salvation, what the Reverend does in the name of God and bloodlines." His voice hardened. "I've buried too many who didn't survive his divine order." Rebecca shivered, remembering the mysterious building Isaiah had refused to show them, the correction house where slaves who resisted disappeared. "Our mother helped establish an escape network," Naomi said. Moses nodded. "Miss Elizabeth was different from the rest of the Blackwoods. She saw us as people." A distant look came into his eyes. "She helped my wife escape north 10 years ago, before the Reverend discovered her involvement and forced her to leave Salvation." "Your wife made it to freedom?" Rebecca asked, hope flaring. "To Philadelphia," Moses confirmed. "I received word through the network last year. She works as a seamstress there." Pride and longing mingled in his voice. "Tonight's journey brings me one step closer to joining her." "You're escaping too?" Sarah asked in surprise. "My time at Salvation ends tonight," he said with quiet determination. "I've guided 27 souls to freedom over the years. You'll be the last before I take my own journey north." They rested for less than an hour before Moses urged them onward. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but he warned they would resume at dawn with renewed intensity. "We need to reach the river before daylight," he explained. "A boat will be waiting to take us to the next safe house." The journey through the swamp grew more difficult as fatigue set in. Twice, Sarah stumbled and would have fallen face first into the murky water if not for Moses's quick reflexes. Rebecca's hands were scratched and bleeding from clutching at cypress knees and branches to maintain her balance on the treacherous ground. Finally, the dense swamp began to thin, giving way to reedy marshland. Ahead, Rebecca could make out the silvery ribbon of a river cutting through the landscape, its surface shimmering in the pre-dawn light. "The Savannah River," Moses confirmed, pointing toward a barely visible dock, half hidden among the reeds. "Our passage to the next stage." As they approached the dock, a figure rose from concealment, an older white man with a weathered face and wary eyes. He wore the rough clothing of a river fisherman and carried a gaff hook that could serve as both tool and weapon. "You're late, Moses," the man said by way of greeting. "Dawn's coming fast." "Complications," Moses replied simply. "The Reverend's nieces were discovered missing earlier than expected." The fisherman's eyebrows rose as he took in the bedraggled appearance of Sarah and Rebecca. "These are Blackwood's nieces, Elijah Blackwood's bloodkin. The ones Miss Elizabeth wrote about," Moses confirmed. "The ones she feared would become his next victims." The fisherman's hard expression softened slightly. "Elizabeth was a good woman, one of the few from those parts." He gestured toward a small fishing boat moored to the dock. "Let's get moving." Patrols checked the river crossing at dawn. As they boarded the simple craft, Rebecca noticed for the first time that Moses carried a small bundle similar to their own. The reality of his situation struck her anew. He was risking everything to help them, leaving behind the only life he'd known for an uncertain future. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. "For everything." Moses nodded acknowledgement but said nothing, helping the fisherman push the boat away from the dock and into the current. The man, who introduced himself only as Turner, used a long pole to guide the craft through the shallows. keeping to the shadows cast by overhanging trees along the riverbank. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles downriver when the sound of hoofbeats reached them from the road that occasionally became visible through breaks in the shoreline vegetation. Turner immediately steered the boat into a densely overgrown inlet, where they waited in tense silence as a patrol of 4 mounted men passed by on the parallel road. "Salvation overseers," Moses whispered, identifying the riders. "They'll have others watching the main crossing points." "We're not taking any crossing, they'll be watching," Turner assured them, pushing the boat back into the current once the patrol had passed. "There's a ford 5 miles downstream that only locals know. My brother will meet us there with a wagon." The eastern sky was lightening to a pale grey as their boat approached a shallow section of river, where the current ran swift but navigable. On the far shore, partially hidden among a stand of willows, waited a covered wagon with a team of oxen. "That's our transportation to the next safe house," Turner explained as he guided the boat toward the Georgia side of the river. "From there you'll connect with conductors who'll move you along the Underground Railroad toward the north." "How far must we travel?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Philadelphia is the nearest truly safe city," Turner replied. "About 600 miles from here. The journey typically takes weeks, moving only at night, hiding during daylight." Rebecca felt her heart sink at the enormity of what lay ahead. They had barely survived 1 night of flight, and Turner was describing weeks of similar hardship. As if reading her thoughts, Moses spoke up. "Each step of the journey is planned, with safe houses along the way. The network your mother helped establish has grown stronger over the years. Hundreds have traveled this route to freedom." They reached the shore and disembarked, Turner and Moses pulling the boat up onto the bank and concealing it among the reeds. The sound of hoofbeats reached them again, this time from the South Carolina side of the river. "More patrols," Turner muttered. "We need to move quickly." They waded across the shallow ford, the cold water once again soaking their already damp clothing. Turner's brother, a taciturn man who offered only the name John, helped them into the wagon, where they found rough blankets to wrap around their shivering forms. "The bottom has a false compartment," John explained, lifting a section of the wagon bed to reveal a narrow space barely large enough for 3 people to lie, side by side. "You'll need to hide in there when we pass through populated areas or if we encounter patrols." The thought of being confined in that dark, cramped space made Rebecca's breath catch with claustrophobic fear, but she nodded understanding. Whatever it took to escape Salvation's shadow, she would endure. As the wagon began to move along a rutted dirt road leading away from the river, Moses turned to the sisters with grave intensity. "The documents you copied, the evidence of the Reverend's program, keep them safe. When you reach Philadelphia, seek out the Anti-Slavery Society. They have lawyers who can use such evidence to protect others, perhaps even prosecute." "You sound as if you won't be with us," Rebecca observed, concern rising. "Our paths will diverge at the next safe house," Moses confirmed. "You'll continue north along the main Underground Railroad route. I have other business to attend to first." The wagon jolted over a particularly deep rut, causing Sarah to wince in pain. She had been unusually quiet since they left the swamp, and Rebecca now noticed her sister's face was flushed, despite her obvious chills. "Sarah, are you ill?" she asked, placing a hand on her sister's forehead. The skin beneath her fingers burned with fever. "Just tired," Sarah murmured, but her glazed eyes and labored breathing suggested otherwise. Moses examined her with concern, gently checking her pulse and examining a long scratch on her arm that had gone unnoticed during their flight. The wound was angry and swollen, with red streaks beginning to extend up her arm. "Swamp fever," he diagnosed grimly, "and the wound is infected. She needs a doctor." John shook his head without taking his eyes from the road. "No doctors for 50 miles who wouldn't report fugitives immediately. The safe house has a woman who knows herbs and poultices. She'll have to do." Indeed, the journey to the safe house took most of the day, with two terrifying interludes when they were forced to hide in the false compartment, while John conversed casually with patrols searching for two young white women led astray by a dangerous runaway. By the time they reached their destination, a modest farmhouse set back from the road in a clearing surrounded by pine forest, Sarah was delirious with fever, barely conscious. The farmhouse belonged to a Quaker family named Pemberton, who had been part of the Underground Railroad for 2 generations. Hannah Pemberton, a serene woman with grey-streaked hair and capable hands, immediately took charge of Sarah's care, directing her husband and sons to prepare a room while she gathered her medicines. "The infection is severe," she informed Rebecca after examining Sarah's wound. "I'll do what I can, but she needs rest, days of it, possibly weeks." "Weeks!" Rebecca repeated in dismay. "But the pursuers will assume you've continued northward," Hannah assured her. "It's standard practice for the railroad. Word will be spread that 2 young women matching your description were seen continuing toward Augusta. Meanwhile, you'll remain here until your sister is well enough to travel." The sudden change in plans left Rebecca feeling adrift. The momentum of their escape had carried her through the terror and exhaustion, but now, faced with an indefinite delay, the reality of their situation crashed over her with devastating force. They were fugitives. Their uncle, a respected minister and wealthy plantation owner, would be searching for them with every resource at his disposal. They had evidence of his crimes, but would it matter against his word, his position, his connections? And Sarah, what if she didn't recover? What if the swamp fever and infection proved too severe for Hannah Pemberton's herbal remedies? "Your sister is stronger than she appears," Moses said quietly, seeming to read Rebecca's thoughts once again. They stood on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Blackwood blood carries resilience, whatever else it might contain. "Is that meant to comfort me?" Rebecca asked with a bitter laugh. "The thought that we carry the same blood as that monster?" Moses's scarred face remained impassive. "Blood is just blood. It's what you do with the life it sustains that matters." He nodded toward the farmhouse where Sarah lay fighting fever. "Your sister risked everything to gather evidence against a man who shares her blood. That choice defines her more than any accident of birth." They stood in silence for a moment before Moses spoke again. "I'll leave at dawn. The Pembertons will ensure you reach the next conductor when Sarah is well enough to travel." "You never said what other business takes you away from the main route," Rebecca noted. A complex emotion crossed Moses's face, determination mixed with something darker. There are still people at Salvation who need help, people Naomi couldn't bring with her. Rebecca's heart sank as understanding dawned. "You're going back, after escaping. That's madness. They'll be watching for you now more than ever." "Not for 2 weeks, Moses corrected. "By then I'll have reached Savannah and returned with help. While the Reverend focuses his search northward, we'll extract the remaining members of Naomi's family and others marked for the breeding program." The audacity of the plan left Rebecca speechless. After a moment, she found her voice again. "Is there anything we can do to help? The evidence we gathered—" "Keep it safe," Moses interrupted. "Get it to Philadelphia as planned. That's your mission now." He hesitated before adding, "But there is one thing. Would you write a letter to the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia, explaining what you witnessed at Salvation? Your word, as white women of good family, as Blackwood's own nieces, would carry weight that mine never could." Rebecca nodded without hesitation. "Of course. We'll write it tonight before you leave." Inside the farmhouse, they found Sarah's fever had broken slightly under Hannah's care. Though still weak, she was lucid enough to participate in drafting the letter, adding details about the Blackwood Covenant and the breeding records she had memorized. They worked by lamplight, filling page after page with descriptions of the horrors they had witnessed and the evidence they had gathered. "This feels insufficient somehow," Rebecca said as they sealed the thick packet of papers. Words on paper in exchange for freedom, for lives. Words have power, Moses reminded her, especially when backed by evidence and spoken by those society is willing to hear. He carefully tucked the letter into his own bundle. I'll ensure this reaches Philadelphia through a separate route, in case anything happens to delay your own journey. At dawn, Moses departed with handshakes from the Pemberton men and a bundle of provisions from Hannah. Rebecca watched from the porch as his tall figure disappeared down the road, headed back toward the danger they had so narrowly escaped. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah's condition improved, slowly but steadily, under Hannah Pemberton's skilled care. The infection receded, and the fever broke completely, leaving Sarah weak but determined to continue their journey. During this time, Rebecca helped around the farm to repay the Pembertons' kindness, learning tasks she'd never imagined performing in her sheltered life in Savannah society. You have capable hands, Hannah observed one evening, as Rebecca helped prepare dinner. Few young ladies of your station would adapt so readily. Necessity is a powerful teacher, Rebecca replied with a small smile. Besides, it feels good to be useful rather than merely decorative. But their conversations with the Pembertons during these quiet evenings revealed a worldview entirely different from the one they'd been raised with. A vision of equality and dignity for all people that stood in stark contrast to Elijah Blackwood's twisted hierarchy of blood and divine right. Our faith teaches us that there is that of God in every person, Samuel Pemberton explained one evening. Not just white men, not just the wealthy or educated, every single soul carries divine light. Such ideas would have been considered dangerous heresy at salvation, but here they formed the foundation of daily life. The Pembertons lived their beliefs, risking everything to help strangers along the path to freedom. On their 17th day at the farm, as Sarah finally regained enough strength to walk unassisted around the farmhouse, a visitor arrived after nightfall. A free black man named Daniel, who served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. News from salvation, he announced grimly, after ensuring the doors and windows were secured. The Reverend has expanded his search. He's offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to the return of his nieces, claiming they were abducted by malicious parties intent on family extortion. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. $1,000 would tempt many to betray us. Indeed, Daniel agreed, which is why we must move you immediately. The regular route is too risky now. Too many eyes watching, too many who might recognize you from the descriptions circulating. What alternative do we have? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her lingering weakness. A coastal route, Daniel explained. Less traveled, but with its own dangers. You'll pose as my ailing sister and her companion, traveling north for medical treatment. Your fair complexion will raise fewer questions with that story. The new plan would take them to Charleston, where they would board a ship bound for Baltimore, bypassing the more heavily patrolled inland routes. From Baltimore, another conductor would guide them to Philadelphia and hopefully safety. What of Moses? Rebecca asked. Has there been any word of his return to salvation? Daniel's expression grew somber. That's the other news. The Reverend returned from Augusta earlier than expected. He found evidence of Moses's involvement in your escape and has ordered a special hunt. The usual punishment for slaves who assist in escape attempts is he didn't need to finish. They had seen the correction house from a distance, heard the stories of what happened there. We need to warn him, Rebecca insisted. He's returning to a trap. Messages have been sent through the network, Daniel assured her, but Moses is determined. He made a promise to Naomi, and he means to keep it, regardless of the risk. They departed the following night, saying emotional farewells to the Pembertons, who had become friends in their short time together. Daniel had brought appropriate clothing for their new identities, simple but respectable dresses that would attract little attention, and head coverings to partially conceal their distinctive Blackwood features. The journey to Charleston took 4 days, traveling mostly at night, staying at predetermined safe houses along the way. Sarah grew stronger each day, her natural resilience asserting itself as Rebecca had prayed it would. By the time they reached the port city, she was able to walk for extended periods without assistance, though she still tired quickly. Charleston bustled with activity, the harbour crowded with ships loading cotton for northern factories and European markets. Daniel guided them expertly through the streets, avoiding the slave markets and auction blocks that formed the dark heart of the city's economy. "Our contact works at the harbour master's office," he explained in a low voice as they approached the waterfront. "He'll have secured passage for you on a sympathetic captain's vessel." "Ha!" The harbour master's assistant, a thin man with nervous eyes named Parker, met them at a small dockside tavern. "There's a problem," he informed them without preamble. "The ship you were meant to take has been delayed in Savannah. The next vessel with a trustworthy captain doesn't sail for 5 days." "We can't wait that long," Daniel replied, tension evident in his voice. "Every day increases the risk of discovery." Parker glanced around the tavern before leaning closer. "There is another option. Captain Rhodes sails on the morning tide. He's not part of our network, but he's known to be fair-minded. With sufficient payment, he might agree to take passengers without asking too many questions." It was a risk, but one they had little choice but to take. Their funds from Savannah were nearly depleted, but Sarah had managed to bring jewelry that could be sold or traded if necessary. Daniel arranged a meeting with Captain Rhodes at his ship, the Meridian, a modestly sized merchant vessel that carried cotton to Baltimore and returned with manufactured goods. "I don't involve myself in politics or other people's business," Captain Rhodes stated flatly after hearing their abbreviated story. 2 young women fleeing an abusive guardian, seeking relatives in Philadelphia. "But I have a daughter myself, and I'd hope someone would help her in similar straits." He named his price, which Sarah met by surrendering a gold locket that had belonged to their mother. They boarded before dawn, settling into a small cabin normally reserved for the first mate, who had agreed to bunk with the crew. As the Meridian pulled away from the Charleston dock, Rebecca felt a surge of hope. The sea route seemed to offer a cleaner escape, free from the constant fear of pursuit that had haunted their overland journey. That hope was tested severely during the voyage. A fierce storm battered the ship for 2 days, leaving both sisters incapacitated with seasickness. When the weather finally cleared, Captain Rhodes informed them of a new complication. "Coast Guard cutters been signaling ships leaving southern ports," he explained gruffly, "looking for fugitives matching your general description. They'll likely board us for inspection before we reach Baltimore." Rebecca's heart sank. "What can we do?" "Stay below when they board," Rhodes advised. "I'll tell them my only passengers are my niece, who's been visiting Charleston, and her maid. Miss Sarah, with your fair coloring, you'll play the niece. Miss Rebecca, I'm afraid you'll need to assume the role of servant." The reversal of their planned identities felt like cosmic irony. Sarah, who had initially been more aligned with their uncle's worldview, would represent the privileged class, while Rebecca would temporarily join the ranks of those they'd fled salvation to avoid victimizing. "We'll do whatever is necessary," Rebecca agreed without hesitation. Sarah nodded her concurrence, though her face reflected the same uncomfortable recognition of the situation's bitter symmetry. The Coast Guard cutter intercepted them 2 days later, just as the Maryland coastline appeared on the horizon. 2 officers boarded for inspection, checking the ship's manifest and questioning the captain about his cargo and passengers. Rebecca, dressed in borrowed clothing from the captain's trunk and with her hair covered in the style of a lady's maid, kept her eyes downcast as the officers entered the cabin where she attended to Sarah. Her heart pounded so violently she feared they might hear it, but years of observing house slaves at Salvation had taught her the invisible mannerisms expected of servants in the presence of authority. "Your name, miss?" one officer asked Sarah, who sat primly on the cabin's single chair, the picture of genteel exhaustion. "Caroline Rhodes, sir," she replied, with the perfect hint of Charleston accent they had practiced. "The captain is my uncle. I've been visiting family, and I'm returning to Baltimore, where my father's business is located." The officer's eyes lingered on Sarah's face, and Rebecca feared for a moment that he recognized something of the Blackwood features described in the fugitive notices. But he merely nodded, apparently satisfied with her performance. "And your maid?" he asked, gesturing toward Rebecca without directly addressing her. "This is Mary," Sarah replied smoothly. "She's been with our family for years." The officer barely glanced at Rebecca, his dismissal of a presumed servant more effective than any disguise. After a perfunctory inspection of their small cabin and limited belongings, the officers departed, allowing Captain Rhodes to continue toward Baltimore without further delay. "You both performed admirably," the captain told them that evening as they shared a simple meal in his quarters. "Though I confess, I'm increasingly curious about what would drive two clearly well-bred young ladies to such desperate measures." Rebecca exchanged glances with Sarah before making a decision. They needed allies, and Captain Rhodes had proven himself trustworthy thus far. Over the remains of their meal, they shared a carefully edited version of their experience at Salvation. Elijah Blackwood's twisted theology, his breeding program, and his plans for his nieces. Rhodes listened in stunned silence, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. "I've transported cotton from Blackwood's plantation for years," he said finally, "attended services at his church when in port. I never imagined—" He shook his head as if to clear the disturbing images their story had conjured. "What will you do when you reach Philadelphia?" "Contact the Anti-Slavery Society," Rebecca replied. "Present our evidence and seek their protection and assistance in securing our legal independence from our uncle's guardianship." Rhodes nodded thoughtfully. "I know people in Baltimore who can help you make that connection safely. People who've helped others in similar, if less unusual circumstances." They reached Baltimore Harbor the following afternoon. True to his word, Captain Rhodes arranged for a trusted associate to meet them at the dock, a Quaker merchant named Elliot, who was active in abolitionist circles. Under his guidance, they were transported to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, where they would rest for 2 days before the final leg of their journey to Philadelphia. It was here, in the quiet safety of a Baltimore Quaker home, that news reached them of what had occurred at Salvation in their absence. A free black sailor, who had just arrived from Savannah, carried a message from the Underground Railroad network. "Moses returned as planned," Elliot informed them gravely after reading the message. "He managed to help 7 people escape from Salvation, including 2 of Naomi's grandchildren and 3 young women selected for the Reverend's special breeding program." Rebecca felt a surge of hope. "Then he succeeded." Elliot's expression remained somber. "Partially, but in the process, he was captured. The message says he was taken to the correction house 3 days ago. There's been no word since." The news hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Moses had risked returning to hell itself to save others, knowing the terrible price of failure. His capture meant torture, possibly death, all because he had helped them escape and returned to save more. "Is there anything we can do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Any way to help him?" Elliot shook his head sadly. "The network in Georgia is scrambling to respond, but Blackwood has tightened security throughout the plantation. For now, all we can do is ensure your safe arrival in Philadelphia, where your testimony and evidence might eventually help bring justice to Salvation." The final journey to Philadelphia took place 2 days later, in the covered wagon of a sympathetic farmer who regularly transported goods between the 2 cities. As they crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state where, theoretically, their uncle's reach couldn't extend, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders, even as her heart remained heavy with concern for Moses and the others left behind. Philadelphia welcomed them with the bustling energy of a northern city untouched by the peculiar institution that defined the South. The noise, the crowds, the sense of purpose and progress, all stood in stark contrast to the oppressive stillness of Salvation. Their first meeting with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society took place in the modest office of a lawyer named Theodore Wilson, who specialized in cases involving fugitives and manumission. Wilson listened intently as they presented their evidence: Sarah's meticulous copies of the Blackwood Covenant and breeding records, their personal testimony of what they had witnessed, and the letter they had written at the Pemberton farm. "This is extraordinary," Wilson said when they had finished. "I've documented many abuses within the slave system, but the scale and systematic nature of Reverend Blackwood's program is unlike anything I've encountered. Can you use it?" Rebecca asked urgently, "to help those still trapped at salvation?" Wilson's expression was cautiously optimistic. "Your testimony and evidence provide a foundation for legal action. As white women of good family and Blackwood's own blood relatives, your word carries weight that other witnesses might not. But challenging a man of your uncle's standing won't be simple or swift." "We understand the difficulties," Sarah assured him, "but we're committed to seeing this through, whatever it takes." Over the following weeks, they worked closely with Wilson and the Anti-Slavery Society, providing detailed statements and helping identify potential legal vulnerabilities in Elijah Blackwood's operation. Sarah's remarkable memory for details proved invaluable, as did Rebecca's clear recollection of the plantation's physical layout. They lived quietly in a boarding house run by a society member, gradually adjusting to their new reality as witnesses against their own blood. The transition wasn't easy. Nightmares plagued their sleep, and certain sounds or smells could trigger vivid flashbacks to salvation. But they found purpose in their work, and gradually a measure of healing. Word from Georgia came sporadically through the Underground Railroad network. Elijah Blackwood had intensified his search for his nieces, expanding it northward as far as New York, apparently unaware they had stopped in Philadelphia. More disturbing were reports that he had accelerated his breeding program, perhaps fearing exposure of his methods. And Moses, there was no definitive news of his fate for nearly 2 months. When information finally came, it arrived in the form of a woman named Esther, who had recently escaped from salvation with the help of network members who had stepped in to fill Moses's role. "I saw him," she told them, in a voice barely above a whisper when they met in Wilson's office. "After they took him to the correction house, they made an example of him, 30 lashes before the entire plantation. But he never broke, never begged, just quoted scripture back at the Reverend with each stroke." Rebecca closed her eyes against the image, feeling Sarah's hand grasp hers tightly. "Is he alive?" Sarah managed to ask. Esther nodded slowly. "Alive, but changed. After the whipping, the Reverend had him branded, an R for runaway on his cheek opposite the old scars, then back to the fields in chains." Her eyes held a haunted look. "But he still helps others when he can, still whispers hope in the darkness. He told me to find you, to tell you that the evidence you gathered is bearing fruit." "What did he mean?" Rebecca asked, puzzled. "Word has spread among neighboring plantations about the Reverend's methods," Esther explained. "Some of the more God-fearing owners have begun to distance themselves from him. The local magistrate has started asking questions, and a northern journalist has been asking around town, though no one will speak to him directly." Theodore Wilson leaned forward, suddenly alert. "A journalist? Do you know which paper?" "The Liberator," they said. "From Boston." Wilson's expression brightened considerably. "William Lloyd Garrison's paper. If they're investigating, it means our campaign is gaining traction." Over the next several months, their case against Elijah Blackwood built steadily. Wilson used his connections to bring their evidence to the attention of influential abolitionists, sympathetic politicians, and religious leaders shocked by Blackwood's blasphemous justifications for his breeding program. The Liberator published a series of articles outlining the allegations against a prominent Georgia minister, without naming him directly, enough to put pressure on local authorities while protecting the newspaper from libel charges. 6 months after their arrival in Philadelphia, a letter arrived from Georgia that changed everything. It came from the county prosecutor in Augusta, a man named James Harrington, who had attended law school with Wilson in his youth. The letter was brief but momentous. Based on evidence provided by multiple witnesses, including former residents of the plantation in question, I have initiated an investigation into the activities at Salvation. While Georgia law permits slavery, it does not sanction some of the specific practices alleged to occur there. Testimony from the Reverend's nieces would be invaluable in this proceeding, should they be willing to return under protection of the court. The request presented an agonizing choice: return to Georgia to face their uncle and the place that haunted their nightmares, or remain safely in Philadelphia while others fought the battle they had begun. "We have to go," Sarah said without hesitation after reading the letter. "Our testimony in person could make the difference." Rebecca felt less certain. "It's dangerous. Uncle still has legal guardianship over us. What if the court favors him? What if the whole investigation is a ruse to bring us back under his control?" Wilson shared her concerns, but offered a potential safeguard. "I can petition the court for temporary independence based on your age and the nature of the allegations. At 19 and 17, with evidence of your uncle's intentions toward you, there's precedent for granting such protection during the proceedings." After days of deliberation and prayer, they made their decision. They would return to Georgia, face their uncle, and tell the truth about salvation, not just for themselves, but for Moses, Naomi, and all those still trapped in Elijah Blackwood's twisted version of divine order. The journey south felt like moving backward in time, each mile bringing them closer to the darkness they had fled. They traveled with an escort provided by the Anti-Slavery Society, 2 men who had formerly served as federal marshals and now worked as private investigators in cases involving fugitive slaves. Their presence provided some security, but nothing could fully ease the dread that built as they approached Georgia. Augusta in autumn was beautiful in a way that seemed at odds with their purpose. The trees along the Savannah River blazed with color, and the air carried the crisp promise of cooler days ahead. They stayed in the home of Prosecutor Harrington, whose wife, a quietly determined woman named Margaret, had been involved in charitable work that occasionally intersected with the Underground Railroad. "Your courage in returning is remarkable," Margaret told them on their first evening. "Few would risk what you're risking to see justice done. We have less to lose than those still at Salvation," Rebecca replied simply. The preliminary hearing began 3 days later in the Augusta courthouse. The sisters wore their finest dresses, sent from Philadelphia by the Anti-Slavery Society ladies, and entered the courtroom with heads held high despite the whispers that followed them. Elijah Blackwood sat on the opposite side of the room, his imposing figure unchanged, but his expression thunderous as he saw his nieces enter with the prosecution, rather than returning repentantly to his side. Isaiah sat behind him, along with several other Salvation overseers and neighboring plantation owners who had come to support a fellow slaveholder against what many viewed as northern interference in southern affairs. The hearing was closed to general spectators due to the sensitive nature of the allegations, but the room still held nearly 30 people, court officials, witnesses waiting to testify, and representatives from several churches concerned about claims made against one of their most prominent ministers. Prosecutor Harrington opened the proceedings with a measured statement of the case against Reverend Blackwood, not attacking slavery itself, which would have immediately alienated the court, but focusing on the specific abuses alleged: forced breeding of slaves for sale, inhumane punishment, and the use of religion to justify practices that violated even Georgia's permissive slave codes. When Rebecca took the stand, she felt her uncle's gaze burning into her, but refused to look in his direction. Instead, she focused on the judge, a stern-faced older man named Judge Carlton, who had a reputation for strict adherence to the law, regardless of personal views. "Miss Blackwood," Harrington began gently. "Please tell the court how you came to live at your uncle's plantation, Salvation." Step by step, Rebecca recounted their arrival at Salvation, their gradual discovery of its true nature, and the horrifying realization of their uncle's intentions for them. She described the breeding barns, the coded language of the Blackwood Covenant, and the systematic program to inject Blackwood blood into generations of slaves. When asked about their escape, she spoke of Moses with undisguised admiration, emphasizing his courage and principles without mentioning his current whereabouts or the Underground Railroad network that had aided them. Throughout her testimony, Blackwood's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Rutledge, objected repeatedly, particularly when Rebecca described the Reverend's religious justifications for his actions. Each time, Judge Carlton overruled him, allowing her to continue. When Sarah took the stand, she provided the detailed evidence only she had memorized. Specific passages from the covenant, names and dates from breeding records, financial figures showing profits from the sale of specially bred slaves. Her precise recall left little room for doubt about the existence and extent of the program. Blackwood himself testified last, his deep voice filling the courtroom with the same authoritative tone he used in his sermons. He denied none of the basic facts presented. The breeding program existed. He personally selected pairings. He believed in the importance of bloodlines. But he rejected the characterization of these activities as abusive or unchristian. God established order and hierarchy from the moment of creation, he proclaimed. The mixing of blood between master and slave has occurred throughout history. My innovation was merely to bring scientific method and religious purpose to what was previously left to chance and base instinct. When asked directly about his intentions toward his nieces, he was equally unapologetic. The Blackwood line carries divine purpose. My sister betrayed that purpose by marrying outside our circle. I sought only to restore what was lost, to ensure the continuation of God's chosen bloodline. The courtroom sat in stunned silence at this admission. Even Rutledge seemed momentarily at a loss for how to redirect his client's testimony. Judge Carlton recessed the hearing after Blackwood's testimony, announcing he would review the evidence and provide a ruling on whether the case warranted a full trial the following day. As they left the courthouse, Rebecca noticed several of Blackwood's former supporters keeping their distance, clearly disturbed by what they had heard. That evening, as they waited anxiously at the Harrington home, an unexpected visitor arrived, Naomi, who had escaped from Salvation in the chaos following the initial investigation. "I had to come," she told them, her eyes filled with tears, "to thank you for what you're doing. Word has spread throughout the quarters that the Reverend might finally face justice." "Have you seen Moses?" Rebecca asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Naomi nodded slowly. "He's alive, broken in body perhaps, but not in spirit. When news of your testimony reached Salvation, he smiled for the first time since his return." She squeezed Rebecca's hand. "He said to tell you that freedom comes in many forms, and that you've brought the first taste of it to those who never thought to experience it." The next morning, Judge Carlton delivered his ruling in a packed courtroom. His weathered face gave no indication of his decision until he began to speak. "The evidence presented in this preliminary hearing is deeply disturbing, regardless of one's views on the institution of slavery itself," he began. "While Georgia law permits the ownership of persons as property, it does not sanction cruelty for cruelty's sake, nor does it exempt any citizen from basic Christian morality and decency." He shuffled the papers before him before continuing. "I find sufficient evidence to warrant a full criminal trial on charges of excessive cruelty, perversion of religious office, and immoral practices inconsistent with public welfare. Reverend Blackwood will remain free until trial, but is barred from returning to Salvation, which will be placed under court supervision pending resolution of this matter." A murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's sharp glance. "Additionally," Carlton continued, I am granting the petition for independence filed on behalf of Sarah and Rebecca Blackwood. Given the nature of Reverend Blackwood's admitted intentions toward his nieces, continuing guardianship would be grossly inappropriate. They are hereby released from his authority, with their inheritance from their mother's estate to be administered by the court until they reach the age of 21 or marry. The judge's gavel fell with a sharp crack, and Rebecca felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Beside her, Sarah grasped her hand so tightly it hurt, but the pain was welcome, a reminder that they were alive, free, and had taken the first step toward justice for those still at salvation. Outside the courthouse, they faced a small crowd that had gathered despite the closed hearing. Opinions were clearly divided. Some faces showed support, others hostility. Elijah Blackwood emerged minutes later, his expression darkening further when he saw his nieces still present. For a moment, he looked as though he might approach them, perhaps make a final attempt to assert his authority or defend his actions. Instead, he simply stared, his eyes conveying a mixture of rage and something Rebecca was shocked to recognize as genuine bewilderment. In his mind, he had been fulfilling divine purpose, and he could not comprehend how his own blood could betray what he saw as their destiny. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, no longer afraid. "Blood is just blood, Uncle," she said, loud enough for him to hear across the courthouse steps. "It's what you do with the life it sustains that matters." She couldn't be certain, but she thought she saw Moses's words land like physical blows. Blackwood turned away without responding, striding toward a waiting carriage, with Isaiah following close behind. In the months that followed, Rebecca and Sarah remained in Augusta, staying with the Harringtons, while preparing for the full trial. Word reached them that conditions at Salvation had improved dramatically under court supervision. The breeding program had been suspended, the correction house closed, and basic standards of care established for all slaves on the plantation. The trial itself lasted 2 weeks and drew attention from across the South. Newspapers debated the implications. Religious leaders issued conflicting statements about biblical interpretations of slavery, and politicians warned about Northern interference in Southern institutions. In the end, Elijah Blackwood was found guilty on multiple counts of excessive cruelty and perversion of religious office. The court stopped short of challenging slavery itself, but imposed significant penalties, a substantial fine, removal from his ministerial position, and most importantly, the supervised dissolution of Salvation Plantation. The slaves were not freed outright. Georgia law would not permit such a radical step, but the court ordered their sale in family units to approved purchasers who would sign legally binding agreements regarding their treatment. It was an imperfect solution that still left human beings as property, but it ended the systematic abuse that had defined life at Salvation. More significantly, the case established a precedent that even in Georgia, there were limits to what could be done under the guise of slave ownership and religious authority. For Moses, Naomi, and the others who had suffered under Elijah Blackwood's twisted vision of God's will, it represented something they had never expected to see: accountability, however limited, for a master's actions. 1 year after their dramatic escape through the Georgia swamps, Rebecca and Sarah stood on the deck of a northbound ship, watching the coastline recede behind them. They had done all they could in Augusta. The trial was over. Salvation dissolved. Their uncles stripped of power and influence. Now it was time to build new lives in Philadelphia, where they had found support and purpose. "Do you think it made a difference?" Sarah asked quietly, watching the last visible outline of Georgia fade into the horizon. "All we went through, all we did it really change anything?" Rebecca thought of Moses, scarred but unbowed, who had been purchased by an abolitionist sympathizer and legally manumitted once beyond Georgia's borders. He was now working with the Underground Railroad in Maryland, continuing the fight for others' freedom. She thought of Naomi, reunited with her grandchildren and living under the relatively benign ownership of a Quaker family who intended to free them when legally possible. Most of all, she thought of the letter that had arrived just before their departure, written in Moses's careful hand. What happened at Salvation matters, not because it ended slavery or changed the minds of those committed to its continuation. It matters because it showed that truth can prevail against power, that abuse need not be endured in silence, and that even those born to privilege can choose justice over blood. The road to freedom is longer than any of us will travel in our lifetime, but each step makes the next one possible. Yes, Rebecca answered finally, turning from the rail to face her sister. It made a difference. Not the difference we might have hoped for when we were young and thought the world could change in a day, but a real difference nonetheless. Sarah nodded, seemingly satisfied with this assessment. Together, they turned toward the bow of the ship, facing north, toward Philadelphia, toward a future they would shape for themselves, free from the shadow of salvation and the twisted vision of divine will that had nearly consumed them. The ship cut through the waves, carrying them forward into that future, leaving behind the red Georgia clay that had once seemed to bleed beneath Elijah Blackwood's boots. Clay that would, in time, cover over all traces of Salvation Plantation, returning it to the earth from which it had drawn both wealth and suffering. But the truth of what had happened there, the courage of those who had resisted, and the principle that blood alone did not determine destiny, these things would remain, passed down through generations as testament to the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption, for bondage and for freedom.